So we're moving on, and we're moving on to section number 12. And section 12 of the SDS is going to focus on ecological information. All right, so it's basically how does this stuff infect the environment? That's the type of information that I'm going to find in this section of the SDS. Now, is this going to be useful for me? And the answer is yeah, it will be, because it will give me an idea of how I need to dispose of this chemical, right? So if I'm using something in a laboratory, does it get poured down the drain? Well, if it goes into the aquatic river system and it kills out all the fish, and I know that from section 12, I'm probably not going to dump the stuff down the sink, right? So it gives me an idea of waste disposal, and that's why it's kind of important for me to look at this section of the SDS and to take away these, again, very general statements that they are providing me in this section. It's also going to heavily be used for the environmental folks. So I'm going to call them environmental specialists, right? And these are the people that handle spills. These are the people that are very in tune with chemicals and disposal and waste management, and they are going to use section 12 quite heavily. Again, it's going to be general statements for them. They will look that compound up in different databases that are maybe more suitable to what they need to know. But again, the SDS is a great way to start. Okay, so that's really all that I need to say about section number 12. It's going to be disposal. It's going to be how does it affect the environment, and how to become green as far as green chemistry goes. And that's a term that we've seen already too before. All right, section number 13. Section number 13, they're going to follow that up with what they would call disposal considerations. Now, keep in mind that this word consideration, these are things that you need to consider. Hopefully you will follow them, but it doesn't say requirements, right? It says considerations. So all hazardous chemicals, if it is deemed as hazardous, produces hazardous waste, right? And it's how do we dispose of this hazardous waste? How do we get rid of it? Who do we call? Where can it go? What can we do with it so that way it's not hanging out in the lab anymore? So this is regulated. We kind of discussed this before previously in other lecture videos, but this is regulated by what we call the U.S. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And we had an abbreviation for that, and that was RCRA. And EPA also has their hand in this mess as well. And finally, the state authorities will get their hands on it too. Each state typically has their own version of EPA that's kind of out there working. It's these state authorities that come around to our own laboratory on campus, and they just kind of look around and make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we're storing things the way we're supposed to be, and we're disposing of things the proper way. So state authorities will be involved, the EPA will be involved, we're looking at the U.S. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. All of these are kind of legal jurisdictions that we're looking for, or legal requirements. So uses here. If I'm in the laboratory, why would I use section 13? Well, pour it down the drain. That's how we dispose of many of our chemicals, especially in a general wet chemistry lab. But this will give me an idea on if I can do that or not. There's always ways to dispose of chemicals, and I have to look at that disposal, and I have to look at how that gets handled. And section 13 might provide me some more information about how to get rid of the hazardous waste that I am creating in a laboratory environment. So, do I pour it down the drain or not? Well, section 13 could maybe answer that question for me. Okay, section 14. That's what's coming up next. We're almost done. After this one, we've got about 2 more. This is going to be transport information. This specifically talks about how molecules need to be transported. Now, we took a look at the previous sections of the SDS, and we looked at one that was basically involving handling and storage. And this was handling or storage based on transportation, right? So how should these be packaged? How should these be shipped? How should these be stored? And how can they be safe? Well, section 14 is going to take the next step. And section number 14 is really going to talk about transporting chemicals and shipping them the proper way. In case something really didn't get talked about in the other section, section 14 is going to come in and maybe fill in the missing plot holes. So DOT will regulate everything that's in this section. So these are requirements. People have to follow them. And it also provides information on the shipping labels that are required for these compounds. Because again, if I'm handling a vat of acid, well, what should be on that label? What should be known about that compound in case a wreck happens or something weird or funky happens throughout the transportation system? So what are the uses here? Well, these are not really used for me. As a laboratory worker, I'm never really going to look at section 14 to get any type of information at all. My job is not transporting the chemical. My job is to use the chemical. So laboratory workers, laboratory managers, chemical companies, as far as the laboratory tests are concerned, this has no practical use for them at all. However, at those companies, your shipping and receiving departments, and we have them at the college, the shipping and receiving departments can actually get information on these chemicals because that is part of this transportation and shipping. So how does it leave out of the facility? Where does it go? How does it get there? And once it gets there, who accepts it? Who signs off on it? Who agrees that it was delivered in the proper way? So it gives your company, shipping and receiving department at least, a little bit of information about what they need to do and how they need to handle this situation. This includes things like signatures that they will have to do, checking off on the labels and making sure those labels are still on those containers and that they haven't been changed or switched around, and any kind of special instructions that these people would have to know in order to accept the chemical onto the facility and deliver it to where it needs to go to. So that's who's going to be using section 14. It's not really going to be us, but we at least need to mention it and we need to understand that it's there. Okay. Section 15, next to the last section here. This is regulatory information. All right, so what's regulatory information? Well, are there any specifics here on the chemical itself? So for instance, if I have ordered a THC standard and we're doing some marijuana test or THC test, then those are probably going to be regulated, right? We're going to have to keep track of the THC standards. We're going to have to figure out where they're going, where do they end up, who's in charge of looking at them, who's in charge of taking things in and out of that lab. Do you have a log book that's present so that way people can sign and date it saying that they have actually used the chemical and how much did they use? All of that really is regulatory information. If this was radioactive, where does it get stored? How do you store it? How do you dispose of it? When does it get used? Who are the types of people that will use it? Those are the types of things that we're talking about in section 15. So the uses here for laboratory workers, I'm going to say no, not really. Laboratory workers don't have to deal with regulatory information that much. You just do the testing. That's all that you're required to do. It's the other facets of the company that have to basically work with Section 15 and the regulatory authorities to make sure that they are in line and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So employers will use Section 15, and the Department of Environmental Health and Safety will also use Section 15. So for instance, if I'm working for a company and there's a lot of dangerous stuff, the EHS department will probably be present. And their whole job is to make sure that everyone is staying safe and that all of these things are in place to prevent any incidents from happening. So EHS staff will look at this section for regulatory information, and they will specifically be focused on any kind of legal requirement that is necessary for this lab to function. Someone else has done this for you already. Someone else is in charge of it. Let them do their job. And then when you get and receive that chemical in the lab, you can kind of take comfort knowing that someone, hopefully, someone has done their job to make sure that you are legally using that chemical in a laboratory environment. Another example here would be another illicit drug like cocaine. So for instance, let's say we're doing cocaine studies. Well, if we're using cocaine and we are using real cocaine in the laboratory, and maybe some powder has been submitted to the laboratory, and we have real cocaine to compare that to, well, all of this is legal requirement. You can kind of imagine. The DEA and everybody's going to step in and kind of control what's happening here. So we have to make sure that we're following those regulations. We have to make sure that you are trained on those regulations and that someone is in charge to make sure that none of this falls through. So that's the type of information that you might find in Section 15 when it concerns regulatory. Okay. Finally, our last section now, Section 16 in the SDS, is going to move on to what we would just call other information. That's really all that there is here, and this is basically things that they would like to say that doesn't fit in any other category in the SDS itself. So for instance, something that you might see here would be the date of the last SDS. So when did it get updated the last? They will typically date it. They will typically sign off on it. The company at least will, and they will provide a new one in their database. They might not automatically send you out a new one if you already have it, but the next time that you order the chemical, the new version will be sent to you because that is a requirement every single time that we do it. Something else here that they might list will be references. So did they get the information from another resource? If so, where did that come from? So the reference list will be also listed here. That way you can follow up on those types of physical or chemical properties or general statements and see who else is kind of confirming it that's in the SDS itself. Finally, something else that you might see will be hazard ratings that are listed here from other companies, such as NFPA, right? We've talked about NFPA, we talked about the purpose, we talked about the labeling. Well, that information might actually fit under Section 16 as well. Okay, yeah, we have areas that we talk about flammability and reactivity, but never really did we talk about NFPA that much. So NFPA really would find its home in Section 16 because it's really meant for firefighters, and we've talked about the purpose of it already, and maybe this doesn't quite fit in the other sections, so this area would be dedicated to it. The uses. Should I use this as a lab worker? The answer is yeah, you can, because it helps you make sure that you are not the least, the latest. It will help you make sure that you're finding the latest information about the chemical that you're using, and this also helps you assess the risk that are associated with that chemical that you are using that might be in your hand as you read the SDS. Okay? All right, so that finishes up all the sections of the SDS in more detail. Again, it's available for free to each and every one of you for any compound that you're working with in the lab. The SDS can be useful after I've made fun of it, after I've basically told you don't believe a word. Well, don't believe every word, I guess I should say, but it is useful, and it is a document that I could use to get some general information with, but keep in mind that it's meant for other people here. It's not really meant for laboratory workers, at least the whole document itself is not. The SDS is really meant for other people in other fields to look at and to read, so that way they can take the proper steps that they need to take to make sure that the incident or accident or fire or explosion is handled in the proper way. Most are written, we said, for general industry, so these are large scale, which is why those statements are the way that they are in the SDS document. And some of it is so generic that it is not useful. And there's just no other way to describe it, right? I mean, it's in there. Yeah, it's great statements, but is it practical? Is it useful? The answer sometimes is no, and we just have to accept that fact, okay? That's just how the SDS is going to be. So it is useful to other people. It's written for general industry. It's very generic. Sometimes it's not useful, but sometimes we can go to the document and find what we need, right? Okay, so we're going to end up with the ramp like we always do for this module section. And the R is going to, of course, be recognize. Recognize the hazards that are associated with the chemical that you're using. The A is going to be assess. Assess the risk that is posed by the chemical that you are using in the laboratory. M is going to be minimize. Well, what do we want to minimize? Well, we minimize the exposure by using proper PPE and safety equipment. And then P is prepare. And we're going to prepare based on the hazard and exposure levels. None of this could be taken care of. None of this could be completed without at least an SDS on hand. It's going to tell me everything that I need to know about the chemical pretty much. That is for the ramp at least, right? Recognize the hazards. The SDS is going to provide me that information. How do I assess the risk that's posed? Well, the SDS is going to have information on exposure limits. M, minimize the exposure. Well, the SDS will have information about PPE and about safety steps that I need to take to make sure everything is good to go. And P, prepare. Well, this is going to the SDS is going to prepare me so that way I know how to dispose of the chemical if it spills. I know how to dispose of the waste if it gets generated. I know how to prepare first aid measurements maybe if something happens and I do spill it on myself or in the laboratory. So this finishes up this section of the lecture module. I think we probably have one more section to go, and this section is going to focus on what we call the chemical hygiene plan. So after that section of the lecture module, I think we're pretty much finished. This module is now completed and done, and we can move on to the next module of number 4, but we've got one more section that we're going to have to tackle, and that's coming up next.